Chicago, 1950. Brilliant physicist Rosalind Porter breaks gender barriers at the Manhattan Project's metallurgic lab. Then, in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, she finds herself in a web of intrigue and passion, while still dealing with guilt about her role in the production of the bomb.
Silence and secrets are always interesting.
The novel Atomic Love is a page-turner, and the fifth book by author Jennie Fields. We spoke to Jennie about the writing life and about her new novel of love, desire, and betrayal. Jennie Fields, thank you so much for being with us here today to talk about your new book, Atomic Love, and congratulations on the publication of it.
Thank you.
So maybe we should just start with you telling us a little bit about it. It's a great title, Atomic Love, and fits the book really well. So could you just tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, Atomic Love is about a woman who was a Manhattan Project physicist who helped to create the first atomic reaction, which led to the atom bomb. And when the bomb was dropped, she was absolutely devastated. Like a lot of scientists, and people don't realize this, they never really thought the bomb would be used. They thought it was going to be a deterrent, that it would be a bargaining chip. And a number of scientists even signed a petition trying to get Truman not to drop the bomb, but it never got to him because the Secretary of State didn't believe in it, so it just didn't get to him. So she was devastated when the atomic bomb dropped and so many lives had been lost, and she felt tremendous guilt. And at the same time, her lover, who was her colleague, just broke up with her and kind of disappeared, and she after that lost her job. And so it's now 1950. She's working in Marshall Field's department store in Chicago selling antique jewelry. And she's a physicist. She's approached by her old lover to see her again. He starts to call her all the time. He wants to see her. He wants to tell her something. And then she is subsequently approached by the FBI, who want her to spy on him because they think he's selling secrets to the Russians, atomic secrets.
Your main character of Rosalind is a really interesting person. In 1950, to be a scientist, and before that, even in the late 40s, she would have been a scientist working in a very male-dominated field. How did you decide to write that kind of character?
Well, I came to the book, a few things came together that made me want to write this book. One was that my mother was a scientist in the late 40s, and she gave up science to marry, which was very common then. After the war, men came back, they needed jobs, women were not encouraged to work, and she regretted that decision the rest of her life. And she lived her life as though she were a scientist, only she was mixing, cleaning chemicals, and she was like cooking as though she were a scientist. And so that was one thing. I wanted to write about a female scientist at a time when there really weren't very many female scientists. And then I also wanted to write about the Manhattan Project. This came to me because my mother went to the University of Chicago, and her best friend was her cousin who worked in this Met lab, is what they called it. And she would not tell my mother anything about what she was doing. And my mother just didn't understand why this was so secretive. And she didn't find out till years later that she'd been working on the Manhattan Project. I think she was a clerical worker, but it was something that they were just sworn to secrecy. And so that always fascinated me. I mean, silence and secrets are always interesting. So those two things came together, and I wanted to write about that. And I also wanted to write about Chicago. I'm from Chicago, and I love Chicago. I think it's just such a pure city, such an honest city. There's just no pretense there. And so I thought Chicago in the 1950s was so wonderfully noir, and there was a wonderful feel about it that I wanted to describe. And so this all came together, and the story came out of that.
Did you have to do a lot of research?
I had to read about the making of the atomic bomb. And as somebody who wasn't a scientist, it took a while for me to kind of absorb how the whole, first atomic reaction was created and all of that. It was very interesting. So I read a lot about that. I read a memoir by a woman named Leona Woods, who was the only female scientist on that project, the only female physicist. And she was just like Rosalind, young. She was a mentee of Enrico Fermi. She was very well thought of, but she was the only woman, and she was the youngest member of the team, which I just love that. And so I read her memoirs so I could get a feel of what it was like for her there. And I read a lot of books about atomic spies because very interestingly, some atomic spies never were captured in their lifetimes, but we now know they were definitely atomic spies. They even knew it back then, but they couldn't do anything about it because there was something called the Venona Project. They were sending messages to each other, and they cracked the code and understood what they were saying to each other, but they couldn't use it because they needed to have that access to Russia and to what was going on there for years. And so it wasn't until 1995 when all of this was declassified and published. And so there were some spies that definitely were sharing secrets that nobody knew were at the time from Chicago, a number of them, 2 of them from Chicago. So that was something that was really fun to read about. Another thing I always do when I research another era is I read a lot of magazines and a lot of newspapers because they tell you so much about the attitudes of the era, the clothes and the prices and what people desired, what they wanted to be like. How, the ads will tell you as much as the articles, and I always find that really interesting, having been in advertising for 32 years, ads tell you a lot about the culture. And so I read a lot of that, and that was always really interesting. It certainly was interesting too when I read the news from those newspapers because it's all very skewed, and it tells you what they wanted the public to know at the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting, the things you find. And even it just shows up, on the page for you when you write about Chicago. It's just, you feel you're in a different time and place, which these days is a good place to be.
No kidding. True. I have always been writing while I was working. And so I published my first 3 books while I was working full time and a single mom. And then I wrote The Age of Desire, which was my last book. And I sold it for enough money that I thought, you know what, I'm ready to leave New York. I'm ready to actually live with my husband. And so I came here, and I wasn't sure I would like Nashville, but actually such an amazing writers community here. And I've enjoyed it so much. I mean, I've made so many wonderful writing friends. In all genres, and it's been really terrific that way.
Well, I'd like to just take a minute to read one of the reviews that's by somebody else who lives in Nashville, Ann Patchett.
Right.
Ann Patchett, many of the viewers will probably know. And am I correct? She has a bookstore there.
Anne and Karen Hayes started a bookstore called Parnassus, and it's been tremendously successful and really the center of the community here. Everybody goes to the readings. You've never seen such well-attended readings in your life.
So here's what Anne has to say. Atomic Love is a novel of science, love, espionage, beautiful writing, and a heroine who carves a strong path in a world of men. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing left to want. So great review there. And I'll just read one more by Delia Owens, who many people are probably familiar with from her book, Where the Crawdads Sing, which has been on, I think, the bestseller list for quite some time.
2 years.
2 years. Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. A highly charged love story that reveals the dangerous energy at the heart of every real connection. The power of separation and loss propels atomic love into unexpected orbits of intrigue and conspiracy, as riveting as the science they study. So another great review, and there's many more. If they talk about, especially Delia's, about the love story that's part of the book. It's really kind of a triangle, isn't it? Between the two main male characters and Rosalind.
Right. It is a love triangle. I think most people think of love triangles as one man and two women, and I think of it as one woman and two men.
Yeah.
Word.
When I was reading this, not only did I feel as if I was escaping, but I started to wonder about the, in the context of where we are today, like with Me Too and all of these, a lot more awareness and women in the workplace not, tolerating things that used to be tolerated. Did you have any of that in mind when you wrote?
Well, I wanted, to talk about what it was like for a woman in a workplace like that. I don't know if you remember, there's a little section where she realizes that if she speaks loudly and in a woman's octave, especially when she gets upset, her voice goes higher and higher, then nobody hears a word she says. And they just ignore her. And I experienced this myself in advertising, and I wanted to be heard. So I learned the more upset I got, the more I lowered my voice and lowered my volume. And I learned that by doing that, people would lean forward because they wanted to know what I was saying. And it worked so much better. And it gave me a power I didn't know I could have. And so I wanted to tell that story for Rosalind because, at first everyone pretty much ignores her. She's in a group of men. She's the only woman. And I wanted her to find her own power in that group and to get them to pay attention to the things that she could see that sometimes the men couldn't see.
And the men are really well-drawn characters. Can you tell us a little bit about them? There's Weaver and then there's Charlie. Two men.
Right. So Weaver is, he is a charming, handsome Brit who comes to America to work on the Manhattan Project. And he immediately kind of grabs up Rosalind and they fall in love, and she thinks they're in love and everything's going great. And then very precipitously, he drops her and betrays her. And she doesn't understand why, but there's a lot of reasons why she doesn't understand why. There's secrets behind his actions. And, I think he really does love her. And that's what the book begins to reveal as you read it. I didn't want anyone to be a villain. I don't think there are, well, maybe there are. I'm beginning to believe there are villains in the world. I didn't used to think so. But there are not that many people who are true villains. They do things for reasons. And in his case, he had some very complex reasons about why he did what he did. Charlie is very different. Charlie is a person who's been through real hell. I mean, he was in a prisoner of war camp in Japan for a number of years, where he was horribly tortured and, almost died, and had people around him dying all the time. And he is a very wounded person emotionally and physically. And he's somebody who, is trying to make his way in the world, trying to get past this horrible experience, but really suffering from PTSD. And so, but at the same time, with all he's been through, he's got this very perfect moral compass. He knows what he believes. He knows what he wants to have happen. And he has a sort of inner patience that somebody who's suffered as he has can find that many people can't find. And so he's just really a very, very different person from Weaver. So she's got two choices to make. They're not as obvious a choice as you might think, but.
Right. Right. Did you think about at all, one thing I thought about when I was reading about Charlie's experiences in the POW camp was sort of, that made it another interesting layer to the book, I felt, because here Rosalind worked on this process that made this bomb that ended the war, yet she feels conflicted about that. And then, here's this person who she becomes interested in who suffered badly at the hands of the Japanese. So it's like this morality question comes into play, or ethics, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think there is no black and white with questions like this. Was it right to drop the bomb? I mean, my heart tells me it probably wasn't right to drop the bomb, that they might have been able to get out of the war, make Japan surrender eventually. They were in very bad shape by the time the bomb was dropped. Did they have to drop it twice? I don't think that there are clear answers to most important questions. And so I wanted to leave it up there for the reader to decide.
Another question about what we see today with a lot of people being suspicious of science. What would you think Rosalind would say about something like that?
I have thought about that very thing. I think she'd be horrified. I think she would not understand at all why people don't believe in science right now. I don't understand at all why people don't believe in science right now. But in the 1950s, it's important to note that science was king. 1949, Jonas Salk invented the polio vaccine. Children were becoming crippled all over the country, sort of mysteriously and suddenly. And people, many of them died, or they would be in iron lungs for the rest of their lives, or, they were crippled forever. And, Jonas Salk came up with this vaccine, and the world was all right again. People believed in science. Science would solve the problems of mankind. Now we know mankind creates most of its problems, but, we have never needed science more than we need it now. And the fact there are people denying science out there really offends me. As the daughter of a scientist, particularly, it offends me.
I want to circle back to you talking about being a single mother with children, working full-time and writing. What was that like?
It was very intense. Thank heavens I had a lot of energy back then, which I don't have that much now. But, I remember getting up at 6:10 every morning so I could walk my daughter to school. And I'm not an early bird, to say the least, but, it gave me time to, get her dressed, feed her, get her to school. Then I would come back, drop the dog off, and go grab a train into Manhattan, where I would be a creative director in advertising all day. And you probably know that's a pretty intense job, and then I would come home. I always tried, if I could, to have dinner with my daughter. And then I would put her, I'd spend time with her. I'd put her to bed. And after that, I worked out, because you have to do something that's going to keep you alive. So I worked out for an hour and 15 minutes, and then I wrote. So I usually didn't write until 10:30, 11 p.m. And I wrote till like 1. And it was the only way that I would get time to write, and it mattered to me. And I'm sure I was very slow at getting books out because of that, but at least I was writing. And that, it's always been my love to write. So it pushed me forward, and it made me happy to have that time. So after I went to bed at 1:30 and then got up at 6:10, I didn't get very much sleep for a lot of years.
Did you get your MFA at the Iowa writing program before that, or?
Yeah, I got my MFA right after college. I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. I went to the University of Illinois for undergrad. And so when I got into the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, I cried, because I really wanted to get out of the Midwest. At the time, you grow up somewhere, you've been there your whole life, you want to go somewhere else. And I got into, at the time, University of Massachusetts had a great writing program, and University of New Hampshire had a great writing program. And I got accepted at those, and I was ready to go to New England. And then I got into Iowa. And if you get into Iowa, it's hard to get into Iowa. it's like 30 people are accepted out of 5,000 applicants, at least at the time. And you don't say no, you just go, you know. So I cried, but I went. I'm glad I did. It's been a key to a door for me. You know, when I finished my short stories, I started by writing short stories. It helped them pay attention to read them. When I wrote my first novel and I was looking for an agent, it made an agent pay attention.
Yeah. So you wrote a book about Edith Wharton. That was the one right before this one, before Atomic Love?
Yes, it was my last book. So I don't know if you can see it, but behind me are shelves of Edith Wharton books. I have everything she's ever written. And she continues to inspire me all the time. So I didn't know what my next book was going to be. And my agent at the time said to me, you know, Edith Wharton's your favorite writer. Why don't you write about her? And I discovered that there was this portion of her life where she had been married in this very unhappy marriage to Teddy Wharton, and they had what they called a white marriage back then, which means no sex. And she met this young journalist who was, younger than she was, and she was 45 at the time. And they had this very intense affair. And it's all very clear because she kept perfect diaries of what was going on in her life. She wrote letters to him, love letters. And sadly, which was hard for me to write about, she became like a 16-year-old in love because she'd never been in love before, really. And she'd never had this sexual awakening before. She just thought she wasn't made for such a thing. And so a lot of people think of her as this blue stocking writer, and she's going to write, she wouldn't even think about sex. But in fact, if you read The Age of Innocence, which was written after she had this affair, it changed her writing completely and made her understand desire in a way that she certainly didn't understand before. So that was a lot of fun to write. Frustrating because I didn't want to create this person who was became so starry-eyed in the face of love, but I had to be honest to who she was, and so I was. I tried to make it as close as possible to what I could find.
Were you able to access a lot of her letters and writings and diaries?
Oh, yes. Everything was kept, and a lot of it's at the Beinecke Library at Yale. It was a great experience to go down into the underground room there and put on the gloves and read all the letters. And amazingly, at the time when I wrote that book, it is really astonishing, but I wanted a second character besides her. And so I knew there was this woman who had been her governess and became her literary secretary. And I thought, this woman must have been very close to her, but nobody wrote about her in the biographies. In fact, some of the biographers said she was a German woman. But in fact, she was born in New York. I found that out really quickly. And so I was doing research on her. One night I couldn't sleep, and I got up and I typed her name into a search engine at 2 a.m. and found out that the next week they were auctioning off 100 and I can't remember, something like 121 letters between her and Edith Wharton. That Edith Wharton's letters to her, basically. And it was like, I just couldn't believe that this had happened. And I called Christie's and I said, I'm not expecting them to say, okay. And I said, I'm writing a book about these two women. Is there any way I could read these letters? And the guy said, sure, come on over. So I called into my office because I was still working at the time and said, I have a terrible dental problem. I'm going to the dentist. I don't know how long this is going to take. And I was gone for like 2 days while I read these letters. It was such a thrill to read these letters. And fortunately, they ended up in the Beinecke Library, but nobody knew where they were going to end.
Did I read somewhere that you were in Paris or something when the idea came to you?
I was exactly right. Yes, I was in Paris on a business trip when my agent called and said to me, and I had walked by Edith Wharton's house that very day, and just by accident, and was very excited to find it. And then that night I got this message that my agent had called, please call her back. I called her back, and that's when she said, why don't you write about Edith Wharton? So that was miraculous.
That is miraculous.
Yeah, sometimes there's magic, and you got to accept and enjoy the magic, for sure.
and just go where it takes you.
Right.
Right. So since you wrote about Edith Wharton, was that easier to write about a real person versus a fictional character such as Rosalind?
You know, it really was my choice this time not to write about a real person, because as much as I absolutely loved writing about Edith, and there's something terrific about actually having the arc of a real life to work off of, at the same time, it gave me no freedom to make her do other things or to discover other things. And so I love that I had that experience, but in Atomic Love, I wanted to create my own characters and have them live their own lives. And it was extremely freeing to do that and to not have to, you know, refer back to letters or to biographies and say, did that happen? Oh, would that have happened? I was able to allow Rosalind to be who I wanted her to be, and Charlie and Weaver as well.
So you write, it seems like you write a lot of female main characters. Are most of your books with a female main protagonist?
I would say there's always a female main protagonist, but sometimes there's also male points of view, like Charlie. I'm in Charlie's head in a good portion of the book, as I am in some of my other books where I'm also in male characters' heads. I try to make them a kind of a different point of view. I try to be as accurate as I can to what a male point of view might be.
So what is your writing process now that you're not in advertising and raising young children?
You know, you'd think I'd write faster, but actually I've become a slower writer as I've gotten older because I am more careful, I think. And you have to shut your inner editor up sometimes because it gets in the way. I generally write in the afternoons now. I do errands and other stuff and emails and get them out of the way in the morning. And then after lunch, I usually take a real quick nap, and I always took a nap. Even when I was in advertising, I took a nap. And then I have a cup of tea and I start to write. And my best time for writing is actually about 5 o'clock, which is usually when I have to stop and make dinner. And I'm always really annoyed by that. So if it's going really well, I just don't stop and make dinner. But I really can't write for more than 3 hours. I mean, I'm burned out at 3 hours, unless I've hit something. You know, if I've opened up a box and there's just all this stuff in there and I must write about it. Sometimes you can have these wondrous moments where you could write for hours and not stop, but that's generally not the case. And, you know, Ann Patchett once said to me, and I thought this was so brilliant and so true. She said, you know, there's the times when you just feel like you're just inspired and it just pours out of you and it's just wonderful and it really is good. And then there's the times you just hammer and hammer and hammer away at it and you know it's not good, but you're going to change it, you're going to fix it, and in the end you can't remember which was which. And she's right. I mean, you really can't, which is why you have to hammer away at it when those rare moments of true, you know, muse and inspiration don't come along all the time. You just got to work.
Are you and Anne friends? I kind of picture you two hanging out together or something.
We hang out a lot together. She lives down the block from me and we walk our dogs pretty much every night together. So we say, how was your writing day? How was your writing day?
Well, Jennie Fields, thank you so much for being with us today. It was a great pleasure to talk to you about your new book, Atomic Love.
Thank you.